Okay, today we're going to be looking at triad arpeggios. This is our first installment in our arpeggio module series. This is a super easy way to learn your triad arpeggios over the whole fretboard. Basically, if you know an open G chord, you can know your arpeggios over your entire fretboard. Before we get started, let's talk about the structure for a major chord. A major chord consists of a root, a major third, and a perfect fifth, or that means a starting note, a note that's 4 half steps above that starting note, and a note that's 7 half steps above the starting note. We're going to start by looking at some open position chords that everybody learned like the first week they ever picked up a guitar. But bear with me because this is a really cool way to learn your big sweep patterns just by tying these chord shapes together. Also, when people are learning chords initially, you might think that, man, I got to learn all these open position chords. Well, actually, it's all the same information. If you look at it from a different perspective, like everything we talk about here, you're actually just taking one chord, and that chord morphs into your other chords as you move it across the fretboard. Let's start with a chord that is probably one of the first chords you ever learned, G major. It's the notes G, B, and D. G is the root, B is the major third, D is the perfect fifth. If you don't know the interval structure of this particular voicing, you should. Now we're going to take this exact same interval structure and move to the next higher set of strings. You'll notice that our root that was in the high E string, we're going to lose that, but everything else stays the same. And obviously our G chord is now turned into a C chord, with C being the root, E being the third, and G being the fifth. If we were to take our C chord and move it to the next higher set of strings again and up a fret, you'll notice that our C turns into an F chord. It's got the same interval structure as the C chord, except now we use the notes F, A, and C for the root, the third, and the fifth. If we take this chord shape and move it back a fret, you'll notice that it's actually the top 4 strings of an E chord, with E being the root, G sharp being the major third, and B being the fifth. Following the same procedure, if we take the E major chord shape and move it to the next higher set of strings, it turns into our A major chord. Same voicing. We're just missing that note that used to be on the high E string now. Also, A is your root now, C sharp's your major third, and E is your perfect fifth. And doing this one more time, your A chord, when put on the next higher set of strings, turns into your D chord. Same voicing. Missing that top string you had on your A chord. We've also got the notes D, F sharp, and A for the root, third, and fifth. And you might notice that the top 3 strings of the D voicing, the fifth, the root, and the third, is the exact same as the top 3 strings of the voicing of the C chord. So essentially, when you first started playing guitar and thought you had to learn a bunch of different open position chords, you didn't really. It's all one and the same. Well, it's important to go ahead and memorize the voicing or the interval structure for each one of those chord patterns, meaning where the root is, the third, and the fifth, where those are located. What we're going to look at now is where the root patterns are, just the octave patterns. Alright, let's start with the G form octave pattern. This is a note on the low and high E strings and 3 frets back on the G string. Move this to the next set of strings, you'll see it turns into our C form octave pattern. It's a note on the A string, 2 frets back now on the B string. We move that shape to the next set of strings, it becomes our F root pattern. You'll notice the F root pattern move back a half step is the top part of an E form octave pattern. E form octave pattern is a note on the low E, note on the high E, 2 frets higher on the A string. If we take this octave pattern and move it to the next set of strings, it becomes our A form octave pattern. That's a note on the A, 2 frets higher on the G. If we take this octave pattern, move it to the next set of strings, it becomes our D form octave pattern. That's a note on the D, 3 frets higher on the B string. Some of you may have heard of the cage system. It's just a method of hooking those octave patterns we just learned together, being C to A to G to E to D. We're going to throw the F octave pattern out as it's the top part of the E. These octave patterns connect by their shared common note. For instance, if we took a look at C over the entire fretboard, the C octave pattern connects to the A octave pattern, which connects to the G octave pattern, which connects to the E octave pattern, and which then connects to the D octave pattern. Here are the individual shapes as they connect up the entire fretboard. C connects to A, which connects to G, connects to E, connects to D, starting over with C, to A, to G, and finally to E. Here's the whole fretboard again. Now if we went ahead and built the chord form around each one of these octave patterns, meaning filling out the third and the fifth, we'd come up with the following information. Here's the C form. and also displayed as interval information. Here's the A form, also displayed as interval information. The G form, the interval information. The E form, the interval information. And finally the D form and the interval information. Here's the entire fretboard, and the entire fretboard displayed as the interval information for each one of these chord forms tied together. Now, by taking a closer look at this chart, you might notice that we've actually covered the entire fretboard by tying these chord shapes together, but we're missing the third and the fifth in a few locations on the low E string. Obviously this information is duplicated on the high E string, so we'll just go ahead and plug that in. Here's the extra note information displayed on the low E and also displayed as intervals. We've learned all this essentially by learning just one open position G major chord. Super simple. Now that you're able to visualize the entire fretboard, let's talk about how you can apply this information to extract 6-string arpeggio shapes. Now, this program is really not meant to be a discussion of sweep picking technique or what have you outside of. I'll just tell you that when you're crossing multiple strings and there's a single note on each string, you want to make sure that you go to the next string on the same pick stroke. That'll be a little clearer here in a minute. Now, the process for extracting these 6-string arpeggio shapes is basically to start on any note on the low E, play 2 notes on the low and high E strings, and 1 note on each string in between. Now, the major arpeggio obviously has the same structure as a major chord: root, major third, perfect fifth. Due to this, we've got 3 different notes in the low E that we could start on. We could start on either the root, the major third, or the perfect fifth. Now, we want to go ahead and start on the root first, and this is what I'd refer to as the root position. Now, here it is displayed isolated on the fretboard. As you can see, 2 notes in the low E, 2 notes in the high E, 1 note on each string in between. Anytime you're crossing from one string to the next, you're going to use the same stroke. So if you're going ascending the arpeggio, they're all going to be down strokes. Descending the arpeggio, they're all going to be up strokes. You'll notice that when playing these types of arpeggios, the degrees will be played in successive order, meaning you'll go from root to third to fifth to root to third to fifth to root to third to fifth, so on and so forth, no matter what degree you start on, whether it be the first, the third, or the fifth. Underneath the tab, you'll find what I'd suggest for fingering. I usually approach these arpeggios 2 different ways, either using a bar or what I call a crossover technique. On the top fingering, you can see that the 3rd finger is playing both the 10th fret on the A and the D. But on the fingering below, you can see that you use your 2nd finger for the 10th fret on the A, but your 3rd finger for your 10th fret on the D. Now, if you play this slowly, you can see what I mean by a crossover technique. You'll actually cross over from your 2nd finger to plant your 3rd finger on the 10th fret on the D. Sometimes this is easier. If you have a problem with doing the bar method, you can try the crossover technique. I use both. Finally, here's the same arpeggio pattern in context to the rest of the fretboard. Okay, now that you got the gist of things, let's take a look at the 2nd pattern, or what's called the first inversion. This pattern starts in the 3rd of the arpeggio. There's only 1 fingering for this pattern, and here it is in context to the rest of the fretboard. Okay, here's our last possible inversion of the 3rd shape, the 2nd inversion. This starts in the 5th of the arpeggio. Here it is isolated on the fretboard. If you take a look at the fingering, you can see that we combine both the crossover technique and the bar technique, and I've got 2 different ways that you could bar that, either with your 2nd finger or your 3rd finger. And here it is in relation to the rest of the fretboard. Okay, now that you've got your major arpeggios down over the entire fretboard, switching to a minor arpeggio should be really simple. All we're going to do is take that major third and lower it a half step to a minor third. What this means is you now have an arpeggio that has a starting note, a note that's 3 half steps above the root, and a note that's 7 half steps above the root. If we take a look again at our major arpeggio over the entire fretboard, what we're going to do is we're going to take all the major thirds, these are E notes, all E notes, and we lower them 1 half step to minor third intervals, or E flat notes. You'd get the following. One thing that I wanted to point out quickly is the caged octave system that we were using earlier. We can use that to find any note on the fretboard. You might recognize that first octave pattern from the 1st fret on the D to to the 4th fret on the B string. That's my D octave form. Now if that's D, that means my next one should be C, because we still have to spell cage. So if I start on the D of the word caged, my next one should be C, which it is, to A, to G, to E, to D. You can use this method to find any note over the entire fretboard. Everything locks together in the same manner. At any rate, let's take a look at the root position for the minor arpeggio. Here it is isolated on the fretboard. You can see again that we're using two different fingerings on the bottom, either the bar approach or the crossover approach. And here it is in relation to the rest of the fretboard. Alright, first inversion for the minor arpeggio starts on the 3rd. We only have one fingering for it. And here it is with the rest of the fretboard. Finally, second inversion for the minor arpeggio starts on the 5th. We only have one fingering for this. Also, it does incorporate the crossover technique, and here it is with the rest of the fretboard. Okay, for our next arpeggio type, we've got a diminished arpeggio. This is a root, a minor 3rd, and a diminished 5th. So this means a starting note, a note that's 3 half steps above the root, and a note that's 6 half steps above the root now. So the diminished 5th is actually the interval that splits an octave in half, or it's also referred to as a tritone. So if we looked at our minor arpeggio over the entire fretboard again, we're going to take the perfect 5th and lower it a half step to be a diminished 5th. And again, if you wanted to, you could use that cage system to find those octaves. Okay, let's start with the root position. Here it is isolated on the fretboard. If you take a look at the finger on the tab, something you might notice right off is a new technique that I'll use with arpeggios occasionally, or scales or what have you. And that's using the same finger to play 2 different frets on 2 different strings. So as you're moving across to the top 2 strings from the B to the high E, you're going to use your index finger to play both the 7th fret on the B and the 8th fret on the high E. It takes a little getting used to, but it's really a cool technique for extending your range. And here it is with the rest of the fretboard displayed. Okay, next up, first inversion. Here it is isolated on the fretboard. A little bit of a variation in the fingering between the top and bottom. And here it is in conjunction with the rest of the fretboard. Finally, second inversion. Here it is isolated on the fretboard. One fingering, pretty good sized stretch though. And here it is in relation to the rest of the fretboard. Okay, the last arpeggio type we're going to talk about is the augmented arpeggio. This arpeggio, while it's not diatonic to the major scale, it actually comes from the harmonic minor scale, it's still important to know. It consists of a root, a major 3rd, and an augmented 5th. So that's a starting note, note that's 4 half steps above the root and 8 half steps above the root. It can best be visualized by thinking of a major arpeggio and taking the perfect 5th and raising it a half step to an augmented 5th. Now due to the structure of this arpeggio, you essentially have stacked major 3rd intervals, so each note is equidistant. And what this ends up doing is giving you inversion shapes that while the structure might start on a different degree, the shapes are identical. Let's start with the root position. Here it is isolated on the fretboard. Notice if you take a look at the fingering, we've got the crossover technique in place between the G and B strings this time. And here it is in relation to the rest of the fretboard. The first inversion shape is of course identical to the root position shape, only this time it's going to be starting on the 3rd. Here it is isolated on the fretboard and in relation to the rest of the fretboard. Finally, the second inversion shape is of course identical to the first inversion and root position shapes. Here it is isolated on the fretboard and once again in relation to the entire fretboard. In order to truly see the symmetrical nature of this arpeggio, sometimes I just like to take a look at a fretboard with some dots on it instead of having a bunch of numbers or letters or what have you, and you can really see that this arpeggio is the exact same pattern repeating up the fretboard every 4 frets. Alright, that's it for this one. We've covered a lot of material from just starting by learning a G major chord. This module will be the basis for all future arpeggio modules. I've got a lot of different approaches to playing arpeggios outside of these big 6-string patterns. However, if you know the 6-string patterns, you know your whole fretboard. That's the basis of everything. So, check the site for future installments. Catch you later.